Okay, well, it is 7 o'clock, so I think we will get started. I'm sure there'll be people trickling in, but yeah, welcome. Well, hello, folks. Welcome to our first in our series of exclusive online talks for the Kent Archaeological Society. My name's Craig. I'll be doing introductions and trying to keep things running smoothly. Trying to bring a wide range of subjects into your homes over the rest of the year. So we've got some excellent speakers lined up, and we hope you'll join us for those as well. This is our first time, our first time doing this as an online talk. So apologies for any teething problems we may come across. Fingers crossed it'll all go perfectly and we won't have any trouble. 1 second. There we go. So housekeeping, just the boring bits to start with. We will have Tom's talk, after which we'll have time for some questions, if you have any. I hope it goes without saying, but please be courteous and polite. We want to keep it light if we can. You can either, so I'll put a thing in the chat there. You can either raise your hand if you want to speak and ask your question directly to Tom, and we will unmute you, and you can do that. Or if you prefer, you can type your question into the chat and we'll keep an eye on that and we will ask it for you. Can you please keep yourself muted and with cameras off throughout the talk so that we can hear whoever's speaking nice and clearly? We will be recording the session. We're recording now, and it may be posted to our video channels in the future, but no personal data will be shared. And if you ask a question, you prefer it not to go online, we can edit all that out. So just please send us an email and say so if that's the case. So that's me and the boring stuff out of the way. Let me get on to our amazing speaker. This is Dr. Thomas Booth. Tom studied at the University of Sheffield. He has a degree in archaeological science, a master's in human osteology and funerary archaeology, and a PhD in archaeology. He also has a postdoc with the Natural History Museum. And if his LinkedIn profile is up to date, he is currently a Wellcome-funded senior research scientist and bioarchaeologist in the Ancient Genomics Laboratory at the Francis Crick Institute, investigating the genetic history of Britain. That sound right?
Yep. Well done. That's good. That's it. Perfect.
Fantastic. Tom has contributed a wealth of published material on ancient DNA and is opening the door to new understandings of our genetic history at a rapid pace. We are delighted to welcome him here tonight to talk to us about Cheddar Man and the genetic prehistory of Britain. So it's all yours, buddy.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you all. I'm sorry I couldn't come in person, but this is the next best thing. Yeah, so at the Crick Institute, I'm working on a project where we're trying to generate at least 1,000 ancient genomes from people who lived in Britain over the last 10,000 years. And the aim of doing that is to look at just the broad, add to the picture of population history of Britain that we already have, as I'll outline in this talk, in terms of migration and genetic change, but also to look at natural selection through time, particularly natural selection on genetic variants that are linked to disease and diet, because the Francis Crick Institute is a biomedical research centre, so there has to be some biomedical applicability, and that's what we'll get from looking at these disease risk variants, but also we get loads of interesting, fun stuff coming from it from an archaeologist in terms of looking at migration change, as well as things like kinship. So over the last, this is the ancient AGB project at the Skoglund Ancient Genomics Laboratory. So yeah, that's the Francis Crick Institute. If any of you have been there before, it's a marvelous place to work, although the ancient DNA lab is a bit of an anomaly in that we're probably the only lab in the building that would prefer it if you were dead. Everybody else tries to keep people alive. So in terms of the genetic ancient DNA in the last 15 years or so, there's been a big revolution in the technology that lies behind ancient DNA, which is why suddenly ancient DNA seems to become a much more viable and robust prospect than it was maybe 15, 20 years ago. So the way we were doing ancient DNA in the sort of early noughties and the late 90s was through polymerase chain reaction and Sanger sequencing, where if you think about the human genome as 3 billion base pairs long, so base pairs being these letters C, G, A, and T that make up a genetic sequence. There's 3 billion of those in the human genome. And these methods, you could look at maybe hundreds to thousands of these base pairs, and usually you would target a particularly informative part of the genome that you would emphasize, whether it had something to do with their ancestry or something to do with genetic health. And you would sequence those small informative parts. So a tiny portion of an ancient individual's genome. And the problem with these techniques was that it was very difficult to control for contamination. You were never sure whether the sequences that you got back were genuinely from the ancient person or from, say, the last person who happened to touch that bone in the recent past. What's happened in the last 15 years or so has been the advent of next generation sequencing, which has, amongst other things, meant that the cost of sequencing has plummeted, which allows us to sequence hundreds of thousands of sequences of DNA representing sort of millions of base pairs of data from samples. So that not only gives us much richer information rather than these tiny little portions of the genome, we get genome data from all across an individual's genome. It also allows us to develop tools for assessing contamination, so we can assess whether the sequences that we get back are likely to be from the ancient individual or from a modern contamination. And it allows us to control for that and potentially discount the stuff that's contamination. And from that genetic information from across the whole genome, we get an assessment of an ancient individual's whole ancestry. And this sort of brings me to the question of what does geneticists mean when they talk about genetic ancestry? And I think sometimes genetic ancestry and the way that people popularly understand their ancestry in terms of just being all of their ancestors going back into the depths of time, the two concepts are slightly different from one another. It's not direct genealogy because it's only the ancestors from whom you've inherited DNA, and the farther back in time you go, the smaller proportion of your genealogical ancestors you've actually inherited any DNA from. And this is because even though your DNA sequence is an incredibly rich source of information, it is finite. And you only have to go back maybe 10 generations or so where you have more ancestors, or genealogical ancestors, than there is space in your genome. So what happens after that stage is that people who are your genealogical ancestors actually start to fall out of your genetic ancestry. So your genetic ancestry is from a particular pool of your genealogical ancestors from who you've inherited DNA. So when you get back to this graph that I've got up here, it shows the number of your ancestors sort of 17 generations back, and that's in those are the red bars, and then the x-axis is showing their geographical distribution. So as you go back in time, not only your ancestors increasing, they're getting distributed across space. But the blue proportion is sort of 17 generations back. What proportion of those genealogical ancestors are your genetic ancestors? And you can see it's very small. So your genetic ancestry today is largely defined by where your ancestors came from over the last 300 years or so. And then because they are more likely to have inherited DNA from ancestors that lived in the places where they lived, sort of within their genome, you have within the genetics, you have essentially a population history of the places where they're from or the population that they're from. So using that, you can kind of say where most of your genetic ancestors, just the ancestors that you've inherited DNA from, were living at different points in time. So, and that's what ancient DNA can do, is basically anchor those genetic signatures at different points of time, in different places in the past, sort of revealing genetic histories of places. I talk a lot about migration as well. So genetic ancestry is always changing to some extent, sometimes quickly, sometimes more slowly. So you have processes of migration leading to admixture, genetic drift, that's the random accumulation and sort of predominance of certain mutations that happens just by chance, just by who happens to have more children and carry particular ancestries and genetic variants than others in a group. And migration is defined as people moving from area to another and having children. So this is the thing about genetics, is that we only see migration if, or we can only see it consistently if the people migrating, have children in the area, and we see the change in ancestry and sort of the gene pool over time. Substantial ancestry change over time indicates migration, and mass migration or population replacement. Those terms reference an ancestry change, but it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about absolute numbers or the mechanism of why that change has happened. And often the large-scale changes in genetic ancestry that I'll be talking about take period over quite long periods of time, over particularly centuries. And so it should, when we talk about migration and population change linked to migration, it shouldn't be inferred from that we're talking about sort of invasion and conquest or even large numbers of people moving, because at the baseline level, what we're talking about is that groups of people had to have moved, but that for whatever reason, they have more descendants that live, that more descendants that live until child rearing age, so lives to produce descendants themselves. So over the long term, there's lots of different factors that can influence those things, differences in birth rates, differences in infant mortality, particularly, or things like birth control. So these migrations, at the moment, we're still sort of dealing with how to interpret these ancestry changes and migrations that we see. You don't necessarily have to read into them straight away that this is about mass migrations and displacement of people, because it's happening over hundreds of years. So moving to the story of Britain, at least from the end of the last ice age, so from around 18,000 to 11,000 BC, Europe and Britain were still coming out of glacial conditions. Britain was still connected to Europe by this vast lowland landscape known as Doggerland. So Europe was just one part of the Britain was just one part of the European northwestern peninsula, and it's glacial conditions, but Europe steadily warming and inhabited by groups of mobile hunter-gatherers using Magdalenian stone tools. And what happens is that from the genetic information that we have so far from sort of late glacial Europe, so after 20,000 years ago or so 18,000 BC, is that most of northern and central Europe is reoccupied by these groups that had sort of been living in southwestern Europe, so Iberia. So you have this expansion of groups out of Iberia at the end of the last ice age that come to occupy a lot of central and northern Europe, and they carry this kind of ancestry that's named after the site where the site where we have the earliest indications of this ancestor. That's Goya Q2 in Belgium, and they expand outwards and occupy these areas for thousands of years. But after around 14,500 years ago, so 12,500 BC or so, the genetic signature of the people living in Europe changes, and it seems to be as a result of migrations out of what is probably southeastern Europe, people carrying what's referred to as Villa or Western European hunter-gatherer ancestries. And there's mixing with the local people carrying these Goya ancestries, but generally speaking, these Western hunter-gatherer ancestors come to predominate across Western and Central Europe after this date. It seems like that perhaps they were moving into Europe as things got warmer, and perhaps the kind of game that they were hunting became more common in parts of northern and central Europe rather than just in kind of the southern and southeastern Europe. From Britain, we have two genomes from this period in the late Upper Paleolithic. One from Goss Cave in Cheddar Gorge, Somerset, where there's evidence that that remains from here were ritually cannibalized, and one that's about 1,000 years later from Kendrick's Cave in Llandudno, Wales, where it seems the individuals buried at Kendrick's Cave were subject to a more formal cave burial. There's no evidence for cannibalism, and also stable isotope analysis of diet suggests that they had a different kind of diet to the previous individuals. They ate more fish, and like I said, there's no evidence for cannibalism. And the two individuals that have been analysed in this Charlton et al. Paper by Sophie Charlton, who was at the Natural History Museum at the time, found that there was no their ancestors were completely different from one another. The first individual from Goss Cave carried entirely these Goya Q2 ancestries, whereas the individual 1,000 years later in Kendrick's Cave carried this Villa Brunio Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry. So there'd been an almost complete genetic turnover in Britain. over the last 1,000 years. I mean, I say it like that, but I mean, realistically, probably what was more the scenario was that Britain, as part of the northwestern extremity of Europe, was probably seasonally occupied by different groups of hunter-gatherers. And so when these new hunter-gatherers with these new ancestors are moving in, it's likely they were largely entering into a kind of largely an empty landscape. And then this ancestry persists in Britain through into the Mesolithic and through the Younger Dryas. Actually, Britain, so the Younger Dryas is this period where particularly Northern Europe returns to glacial conditions for a few hundred years. And it seems as though that Britain was largely abandoned during this time. We have very little evidence for sites during this in Britain during this period. And then after around 9,700 BC, the warming that occurs after that brings reoccupation. This is the beginning of the Mesolithic in Britain, which sees a shift from post-glacial grasslands to more boreal landscape and a more varied range of things to eat and hunt. And it seems as though that the ancestry of the people who reoccupy Britain through the Mesolithic at this time is similar to that Kendrick's Cave individual carrying these Western European hunter-gatherer ancestries. Whether it's exactly the same population or whether it's a slightly different one that reoccupies Britain from continental Europe after the Younger Dryas is difficult to say. What's interesting is that the genome from Cheddar man from Goss Cave in Somerset, but dating a few thousand years later than those Goss Cave cannibalized people. They have around 15% of ancestry from that Goye Q2 population. So the ancestry that's represented in those Goss Caves individuals. So that might suggest that Britain was actually reoccupied by a slightly different population that had mixed more with that those previous groups when they went back into continental Europe. Or it could be that Cheddar man is a bit of an outlier in this sense and is a recent migrant from somewhere else in Europe. So in terms of the picture or the rest of the story in Britain and Europe generally through the next few thousand years, there's these broad ancestries that are relevant to understanding what happens. So this Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry is a bit more complicated than this picture gives, but broadly speaking, this Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry is predominant across Western Central Europe, and you have this yellow ancestry, which in the 8,000 BC is predominant in Anatolia, so what's now Turkey. And then later, from around 5,000 BC or so, you have this ancestry called Western Steppe herd ancestry in pink, which develops as a result of mixtures of different ancestries just north of the Black Sea and what's now Russia and Ukraine. And as I mentioned, Mesolithic Britain is largely continuous with through the Mesolithic their ancestry is largely continuous with those Kendrick's Cave individuals carrying this Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry. So this plot on here is a principal components analysis showing what this does is distribute ancient individuals and modern individuals in space based on how genetically similar or different they are from each other. So the space itself is defined by genomes of living individuals. So that's the paler genomes in the middle of the plot, and this kind of darker plots are the ancient genomes. And the burgundy ones are Mesolithic populations from Europe, so carrying these Western hunter-gatherer ancestries, and the green ones are the Mesolithic populations of Britain. So they fit perfectly with Mesolithic populations from other parts of Europe. And what you might notice is that these modern populations, these more faded markers, are populations from living populations from Europe, well, Western Eurasia, so Europe and the Near East. And what you'll be able to see is that the Western hunter-gatherers, the Mesolithic populations of Britain and Europe, kind of exist outside of the genetic variation that we see in Europe today. So they belong to a population who essentially, in genetic terms, don't exist, at least in unmixed form, anymore. And when some of the first genomes from Western hunter-gatherers were published, one of the things they looked at were these two variants that are strongly associated with lighter skin pigmentation in modern people from Northern Europe. and as well as eye pigmentation as well. And what they found was there's these two variants that are really highly associated with lighter skin pigmentation in people with recent ancestry from Europe, but they were lacked those genetic variants, the Western hunter-gatherers that they looked at, but they did have this genetic variant that's linked to lighter colored eyes, which suggested that Western hunter-gatherers likely had darker skin and yet light colored eyes. And this was interesting because it had always been assumed that as soon as human groups had started moving into Northern Europe, into northern latitudes, they would have adapted to have had paler skin very quickly, because the idea is that you generate vitamin D through the absorption of UV light. But if you're not getting very much UV light, then such as in more northerly latitudes, then lighter skin is more efficient at absorbing that UV light, whereas dark skin is less efficient. So if you have darker skin in more northern latitudes, generally you tend to be more vitamin D deficient. So the idea was that human groups moved into Northern Europe and they developed lighter skin to avoid vitamin D deficiency. But while there is a few light pigmentation variants amongst Western hunter-gatherer groups, it doesn't seem to be strong selection for them in the way that was expected. So the kind of story of the development of lighter skin pigmentation in Europe seems to be different to the one that was considered. When I was working at the Natural History Museum and we looked at Cheddar man's genome, we looked at a few more variants linked to pigmentation, 36 variants altogether, using this forensic tool which predicts skin pigmentation. And that gave a result that, based on this Fitzpatrick scale that you can see here of skin pigmentation with these faces, it was somewhere between 5 and 6, probably more towards 5. And so this, the Channel 4 and were making a documentary at the time, and they commissioned a bust from the Kennis brothers, and that's what they produced from the pigmentation, and as well as the potentially light colored eyes as well, which we also got a result of light colored eyes for Cheddar man too. And there's been, what's clear when this has been done for Mesolithic people across Europe, across Mesolithic Europe in different times, is that actually there's a lot of variation in skin pigmentation predictions for these individuals across Europe. So for instance, this one in Lochborough and Luxembourg more had kind of olive skin pigmentation, but these two individuals from, one from Denmark and one from Sweden, both were predicted to have a dark skin pigmentation, and this one from Sweden is likely to have lighter pigmentation, skin pigmentation. That's because he has some ancestry from a different population that is too complicated to get into here, which means that he ends up with probably has lighter skin pigmentation as well. So broadly speaking, it's true that Mesolithic populations of Europe likely had darker skin generally than what we associate with Northern Europe today. But there was actually there was some variability around that with, there were actually probably been quite a diverse range of skin pigmentation in Northern Europe, with generally more shifted towards darker skin pigmentation. And these are all probable profiles rather than, absolute predictions, and they're based on predictions of skin pigmentation developed on living groups. But as I mentioned, these earlier groups, there's no living group that's entirely like them genetically. So we can't say for sure that the skin pigmentation genetics in these ancient groups worked in the same way as in living groups. So short of finding a Mesolithic mummy, we can never be 100% sure that this is definitely a prediction. But we can say that definitely the skin pigmentation genetics of Cheddar man and other Mesolithic inhabitants of Europe and Britain were very different to what they are today. And this reflects the fact that they're from this very different population than the one that lives in Britain and Europe today. Supporting, though, that they likely had darker skin than on average than what we see in Europe today, even if we can't define quite how much darker that is very easily, is that there's evidence for very strong selection for all these variants that are linked to lighter skin pigmentation over the last few thousand years. So in Britain, at least, those lighter pigmentation variants don't turn up in Britain until around 2500 BC. And both in Britain and in Europe, there's evidence in the genome for selection for these variants from around 3000 BC or so. So the fact that you have this strong selection for them tells you that, and it's strongly associated with skin pigmentation, says that if there's selection for them, then the skin pigmentation has to have been darker in the past. Otherwise, what is selection acting on. It's very difficult. I mean, it could be that there's some other traits that's being selected for that's linked to these variants, but it seems really unlikely given how strong these variants are linked to skin pigmentation. So that's another sort of form of evidence in the recent years that's come to back up the idea that of Mesolithic populations having darker skin pigmentation. And one of the things that everyone kind of knows of a certain vintage from about Cheddar Man is from the 90s, when there was some original, potentially quite a bit shoddy ancient DNA work done on Cheddar Man's skeleton, where they found a local school teacher in the village of Cheddar shared a maternal lineage, what's called a maternal haplogroup, with Cheddar Man, suggesting this was used to argue that there was 9,000 years of maternal continuity in Cheddar. I mean, there was a lot wrong with this interpretation at the time. Obviously, Cheddar Man couldn't have been a direct maternal ancestor of this person who lived in Cheddar because he's male, so he couldn't pass on his mitochondrial DNA or his maternal lineage. But also, it's more likely that if they do share a maternal lineage, then it's more likely that they share an ancestor in their maternal line in the distant past that they both share, rather than one being directly descended from another. That's quite an unlikely scenario. Not to mention that it turned out later that the teacher wasn't actually born in Cheddar but moved there from the West Country. When we thinking about the whole ancestry, so what I discussed previously about that difference between genealogy and genetic ancestry means that the further back in time that you go, the more ancestors that you have, and your ancestors are increasing exponentially, your genealogical ancestors eventually get to the point where you have more ancestors than there is the population of a particular region. And the way that's accounted for is that your genealogical ancestry goes through certain ancestors multiple times. And eventually you get to the point where everybody who existed in a particular place at a particular time, if they successfully had descendants, are the ancestor of everybody who is alive with that kind of ancestry today. So for Europe, everybody with any kind of recent European ancestry, everybody who lived in Europe in the 10th century AD is their successfully passed on descendants is their ancestor. That's the point at which, sort of, for Europe at least, it all collapses down to the same group of ancestors. So I put a picture of Charlemagne here because, you know, people famously have arguments about people being descended from Charlemagne. Basically, if Charlemagne has any living descendants, then anyone with any kind of European ancestry is likely to be Charlemagne's descendant. And because Cheddar Man lived so long ago, that if he did indeed have any living descendants, it would be the vast majority of people alive today. So moving on specifically to carrying on with the story of Britain, what we see at the beginning of the Neolithic across Europe is that you start to see these people with these ancestries that are these early European farmer ancestries, ultimately from Anatolia, and where the people carrying these ancestries appear across Europe is usually at the point at which we see the beginnings of Neolithic farming begin. So it seems like these migrations of people out of Anatolia over thousands of years steadily introduce the dispersals introduce Neolithic farming practices into Europe. And there's two broad routes. There's one that goes up the Danube into Central Europe, and another that goes along the Mediterranean down and eventually ends up in Iberia. And as these groups move, they're admixing with the local Mesolithic derived populations that they meet there. Sometimes what happens, and often what happens is, and the dynamics are different with each sort of migration route, is that groups of farmers move in and they live largely in parallel with the hunter-gatherers that are living there. And then hundreds, sometimes thousands of years later, these two groups mix more liberally. So you have these sort of parallel populations that are exploiting different landscapes, that are living alongside one another. But those the ancestry from the local Mesolithic don't usually get, even though that as you move further west and north, the amount of the Western hunter-gatherer ancestries increases, but it never becomes the majority, at least in a population level. We get odd individuals where it is, but at a population level, it's always a minority. And this is probably because that farming allows you to maintain larger population sizes And so when the farmers arrive, they're able to maintain much larger population sizes than the hunter-gatherers are. So even if they mix completely, the kind of people who derive from the Mesolithic groups will only have a small genetic legacy over the long term. So in Neolithic Britain, around 4,000 begins around 4,000 BC when we get introduced to the first pottery, new types of material culture like these brownstone axes and tombs and the particular megalithic tombs and megalithic cultures as well. And going back to this figure, if you look at remember the genetics, this is a figure of the ancient people distributed based on how genetically similar or different they are. The Mesolithic populations of Britain are in green, and the Neolithic population that we've got, so after 4,000 BC, this cloud in black here, and this red cloud here is Neolithic populations from Anatolia. So you can see that there's been a big change in the genetic ancestry of people in Britain into the Neolithic, with them having more ancestry related to Anatolia than to the Mesolithic population of Britain. And when you sort of try and model the ancestry of Neolithic populations of Britain with ancestry from plausible populations in continental Europe, bearing in mind that they already had some of the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in their genome as they mixed with populations as they moved across Europe. So we see that there's very little ancestry from the local Neolithic population, the local Mesolithic populations of Britain and the Neolithic group. So if you look at these teal bars at the bottom of this figure, for groups from what is now Wales, there's no, from what we can tell, contribution from local Mesolithic groups. In England, there's a little bit. In Scotland, there definitely is some, but again, it's a minority of the ancestry. And unlike most other parts of Europe, there's no later resurgence of this Mesolithic derived ancestry. So there doesn't seem to be as much of the case of parallel populations living separate from one another before mixing. But this doesn't mean that Mesolithic descended groups were completely displaced or wiped out. Again, this might have a lot to do with the dynamics of different populations. There might also be disease dynamics involved as well. So to bring it to Kent specifically, and I will pepper the talk a little bit with specific examples from Kent. One of the genomes in this study from the Natural History Museum on Neolithic Britain came from the Cauldron Long Barrow, where there's two phases of deposition, a really early phase of deposition around 4,100, 3,900 BC, and a second one, a later episode of deposition of human remains. And we have one genome from here, but unfortunately it's from an undated bone, so it's unclear which phase they belong to, but their ancestry is entirely derived from continental farmers with little or no ancestry from local Mesolithic groups. Where we do see admixture and definite interaction between local groups is in between Neolithic farmers and the local Mesolithic populations is in Western Scotland, where if you look at this figure here, this gives you how much of the ancestry of Neolithic populations, Neolithic individuals in Britain is from these early European farmers, these EEF fraction. And you can see it's pretty constant from 4,000 BC in most of the population. But you have all of these sites in yellow that have substantially lower levels of this early European farmer ancestry, so higher levels of this Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry, indicative of recent admixture between these incoming or recently arrived farmers or their descendants and the local Mesolithic populations. And these are mostly cave sites. So here we do have definite evidence that up until 3,400 BC, at least in Western Scotland, you have groups of people with the local Mesolithic ancestry persisting and interacting with the farming groups. But what you can see is that, what you should be able to see is that over the long term, the ancestry of people in Neolithic Britain doesn't change. So despite having evidence for this sort of interactions in certain parts of Britain, it doesn't affect the population as a whole, suggesting that where this happens, it only happens very regionally and doesn't affect the ancestry of the group as a whole. So this could be happening in lots of different regions, but presumably because the hunter-gatherers have relatively small population sizes, they could be mixing entirely with the local farmers that you see there, but it wouldn't have we wouldn't be able to see that in the national picture. We would have to sort of hit those particular samples in those areas where we have hunter-gatherers from Britain persisting. One of the things that has become a big thing with ancient DNA more recently, and and unlocks all sorts of possibilities, the ability to be able to detect genetic relatives at archaeological sites. And the most particular example of this for Britain, particularly Neolithic Britain, is this Hazleton North Long Barrow from Gloucestershire, where you have 6 generations of a genealogy in the tomb, and there's all sorts of dynamics of patterns of who was having children with who that you can see, patterns of reproduction that you can see in this tomb. So whether or not you ended up in this tomb largely depended, although not exclusively depended, on your descent from one man. And then where you ended up in the tomb, whether it was the north chamber or the south chamber, depended on your descent from 4 different women who he had children with. But then within that, there were these 4 different women that had children with other men, and then the male children from those relationships were also inducted into the tomb, so were potentially adopted into this patriline. So clearly, at least in this case, this tomb was built, the architecture of the tomb was built with these families in mind, with the idea that these people would be interred there. I should emphasize that there was also a substantial minority of people in there who were not genetically related to anybody else in the tomb. So clearly there was some kinship there that had, there was some kinship between these people that had no biological underpinning. And this doesn't apply to every Neolithic tomb. So I wouldn't, other Neolithic tombs where we have multiple individuals don't follow this pattern. This seems something specific to either Hazleton specifically or to certain types of tombs. So we hope to return and get more samples from Cauldron to assess whether individuals in Cauldron show this kind of pattern, or whether they're more like some other tombs we see where very few people are actually genetically related to each other, and if that relates to the architecture of the tomb or where it's situated, or anything else, and what that tells us about these societies. So through the late Neolithic, through from around 3000 BC to 2500 BC, which includes things like the change to groove-rare pottery styles and development of a stone circle and henge building culture, the genetic ancestry of people in Britain stays relatively constant. But across Europe, what we see is that the ancestry of people in particularly Northern and Central Europe begins to change, that you start to see people appearing with these ancestries, these Western steppe herder ancestries that come from around the Black Sea. So again, this indicates a substantial migration or expansion of people carrying these ancestries from the Pontic-Caspian steppe into Western and Southern Europe. And these migrations almost certainly introduced Indo-European languages into Europe. And these dispersals are associated with and the admixture with the local populations that they encounter there in Europe, as well as interactions that occur between these groups before these sort of expansions of the steppe lead to the development of these corded ware family of cultures in Eastern and Central Europe. And to the west of corded ware, you get the development of these bell beaker cultures, which potentially originate in what's now Portugal and diffuse east up into sort of these corded ware zones, where aspects of the bell beaker culture are taken on by people who otherwise who practice, who have carried these steppe ancestries and also have aspects of these corded ware cultures as well. So there's this kind of meeting of two cultures and groups, which leads to these hybrid cultures that are kind of mixed between bell beaker and corded ware. But that diffusion of the beaker cultures from Iberia seems to happen without there being any substantial migration in continental Europe, at least. So in Britain, the bell beaker phenomenon beginning around 2500 BC or so, which is traditionally the beginning of the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age. So that's where we get the first metal working potentially with a short couple of 100-year Copper Age, and then bronze from 2200 BC, defined by this distinctive beaker pottery, greater prominence of single burials, round barrow funerary monuments, and different types of material cultures, different types of arrowheads and buttons. That's how the beaker culture is manifested in Britain, as exemplified by the Amesbury Archer burial. And when we look at the beaker burials, compared to sort of the earlier Neolithic burials or burials from the Beaker period, we see what seems like a very dramatic change in the ancestry of people in Britain. So we go from a point where, from around 2600 BC, where people seem to have no ancestry from these Western steppe herders, to after 2500 BC, where everyone seems to, Western. So these ancestry models that I'm showing you here contain the blue, which is the British Neolithic ancestry, and the red, which is ancestry associated with people associated with Beaker burials in continental Europe. So they're actually a mixture of these steppe ancestries and ancestries from across Neolithic Europe. So actually the steppe ancestries in Britain is around 50% or so, but the overall ancestry change in Britain is quite significant, around 90% by 2000 BC. And this seems quite sudden and impactful, but what you've got to bear in mind is that in the late Neolithic, people are doing things with their dead, are either cremating the dead, in which case we can't get any DNA out, or doing things with the dead which left no archaeological record. We have very, very few, particularly unburnt human remains that date to this period between 3000 and 2500 BC. And the thing is, if those people, whereas the people carrying these steppe ancestries are doing things with their dead which are both highly visible, burying them under big monuments, and also preserve the DNA relatively well compared to these previous rites. So if we had a situation of what we've had previously, where you have parallel groups of migrants and sort of local people living in parallel, if you have one group that are carrying on cremating and doing things with the dead that leave no archaeological record, we wouldn't see them in the genetic record. Whereas these groups, these migrants that come in and have prominent burials, they will be a bias towards them, they'll be overrepresented in the record. So, and what you see in the genetic data, so if you look at this graph again, this is a graph which a figure which shows you the amount of the early European farmer ancestry in different burials through time in BC. And you can see that while there's sort of quite a consistent signature amongst the population as a whole, you get these red outliers that have higher levels of the early European farmer ancestry. And that suggests that there are still populations around that are kind of invisible to us archaeology, that are admixing with these groups of migrants and their descendants, thus producing these admixed individuals, these visible admixed individuals that you see. So looking at these admixed individuals, you could say that you must have populations descended from the local Neolithic groups persisting in Britain up until around 2000 BC or so, when the two ancestries seem to merge. And if we go back to this figure after 2000 BC, everybody seems to have around 10% ancestry from the local Neolithic population of Britain. So certainly a big genetic change occurs, but it seems to be a process that happens over hundreds of years. And for whatever reason, for all those potential reasons I mentioned above, including things like violence or social structures or dominance or disease, difference in birth rates and access to resources, the Neolithic population of Britain have a much smaller genetic legacy than these Beaker migrants. There's also evidence that some of these outliers actually come from different parts of Europe. So it seems like there's a mainstream of migration that's responsible for most of the ancestry coming into Britain from the lower Rhine Valley in what's now the Netherlands. But you get odd individuals that are coming in from different parts of Europe, southern, western Europe, possibly also Ireland, and as well as potentially further east as well. So there's this kind of melting pot of different ancestries in Britain through the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, where you have these this mainstream of ancestry coming in from what's now the Netherlands. You have different ancestries coming in as a minority from other parts of continental Europe, as well as the ancestries and people carrying ancestries from local Neolithic groups. And again, to give an example of this, from the East Kent Access Road near Thanet, on Thanet, you have this skeleton 22053 dating an unaccompanied female dating to sort of the later part of this period that was part of a linear series of flat graves near a round barrow. They have very low steppe related ancestry. You can see it in this figure. Only around 45% of their ancestry, around 45% of their ancestry comes from early European farmers, whereas the average for other Bronze Age burials of that age is around 35% or so. So either they have, it's difficult to distinguish between these different scenarios at this point, but either they had a recent ancestor who had descended from the local Neolithic population, so there was a Neolithic, a population descended from the Neolithic, sort of persisting in Kent, or possibly it's a migrant from somewhere different, potentially southern Europe with that level of early European farmer ancestry. And again, as with Hazleton North and the Neolithic, we can look at genetic relatives as well. It's interesting thinking about the dynamics of migration in this period, that the earliest Beaker-associated ancestry comes from an individual that was buried in a Neolithic tomb, but 2500, around 2500 BC. So this is interesting because this is Neolithic tombs in Britain had been out of use for at least 1,000 years before these Beaker migrants had started to arrive, and they sort of reopened them and start reusing them for some of their burials. So it's clear that migrants and their descendants were interested in these older sites as soon as they arrived, and it's interesting to think about whether this is veneration or appropriation of the cultures and rites of the people that they encountered when they moved into Britain. And specifically, you have this set of genetic relatives from different cemetery sites from around Stonehenge. So you have a man who was buried in a round barrow at Wilsford G54, who was either the uncle or the grandfather of these two individuals who were buried at Amesbury, a different cemetery at Amesbury. But those two individuals who were cousins were buried next to each other at Amesbury. But then the daughter of one of them was buried at another site at Porton Down. And all of these sites are within the Stonehenge landscape. And it's interesting because none of them have any ancestry from the local Neolithic population. Their ancestry seems entirely derived from continental migrants. So this provides evidence both for the fact that communities of people were moving into Britain, so contrary to how the media tends to report on this stuff, there isn't necessarily this. It isn't all just male invasions of male warriors from continental Europe. It has to have been communities of people moving in and settling, but also that they're not going in for any specific iconoclasm. They're are sort of in some way incorporating the cultures that they encounter into their worldview, despite the fact that they're not descended from the people who built them. So specifically with Stonehenge, they're clearly revering Stonehenge to some extent, and yet they must have been aware that they weren't the ones that built it. It was people that were there before them that built, or well, potentially still in the landscape at this stage, that have built it. So there seems to be a mixing to some extent of an inspiration of cultures between them at the same time. And what's also interesting about this group is that sort of more recent analysis of two of those male burials has found that they were actually the offspring of third-degree relatives, so potentially first cousins. So this seems to be highlighting that people who are buried in this landscape come from specific families, and from specific families that seem to put an emphasis on kind of keeping it within the family as well, at least in this small part of Bronze Age Britain. And the Boscombe, in terms of relative, the Boscombe Bowman is an interesting example of it's potentially interesting showcase of the dynamics of sort of migration and connections across Europe during this period. So the Boscombe Bowman was this grave that seems to have been a wooden box where bodies were successively interred over potentially several decades before it was buried. And so what you have is that each time a new body was put in the grave, it disturbed the skeletons that were in there. So you have an articulated burial, which was the last one, surrounded by disarticulated remains of all the other people that have been put in before. And two of them have been subject to genetic analysis, the articulated individual and then a disarticulated skull that was found at his found at his feet. And they were found to be paternal cousins. But what's interesting is their ancestry was quite different from one another. So the articulated burial had very low levels of step ancestry, sort of enough to suggest that their mother or one of their parents was entirely came from the local Neolithic population, or that they came from somewhere further south, potentially Brittany, or further south in Iberia, whereas their ancestry was entirely typical of Bronze Age Britain, with the sort of normal levels of the steppe-related ancestry or the continental Beaker ancestry. And so the interpretation is more slightly towards having come from elsewhere, because of stabilized isotope analysis suggests that both of them moved within their lifetimes. So it's interesting in that you have potentially two people with different ancestries that happen to be cousins, which might hint at there being quite extensive kin networks across Europe. So you have these two people potentially from different ends of Europe that are cousins of one another. So it might say something about who was very mobile. The people belonging to these particular kinship groups were mobile across quite long areas and had networks of exchange based on kinship over quite long distances, which may define some of the mobility and the population movements that we see in the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age. Again, from the early Bronze Age through into the Middle Bronze Age, from around 2000 BC to 1500 BC, the ancestry across Britain stays relatively this, so it's pretty much constant. But we see this increase in early European farmer ancestry, particularly in southern Britain between 1400 and 800 BC. So this is reported in this study by Patterson et al. Out of David Reich's lab in Harvard. But it stays, this changes in southern Britain, so what's now England and Wales, but this happens in southern Britain, but not in northern Britain, so it's now Scotland. And it doesn't come from admixture with Neolithic populations from in Britain. If you try and model this ancestry change through using Neolithic populations from Britain, it doesn't work. This Neolithic ancestry is coming from continental Europe, indicating that there's another episode of migration which affects the ancestry of people in southern Europe. And when you look more closely at this, sort of between, you have these people showing, if you look at this graph again, this is the early European ancestry fraction of individuals through time. And you can see that there's the sort of baseline level of the country as a whole with the blue figures, but then you have these red outliers. And from around 1200 BC to 800 BC, you have these ones from Margaret's Pit and Cliff's End Farm, which have this elevated level of this early European farmer ancestry. And when you try and model them, their ancestry is closer to individuals from what's now southern France. And so these seem to be either first generation migrants or represent enclaves of migrants in southeastern England and in Kent specifically. So in combination with some of the stable isotope results from these as well, which measure mobility, it suggests that they're probably either descendants or first generation migrants from southern France, probably Alpine France or Alpine Europe. And the southeast of Britain, particularly Kent, seems to be this focal point of movements, because you see this ancestry change or begin to happen in Kent from around 1200 BC, but then you see this uptick around 1000 BC. This ancestry that you see in Kent earlier then eventually disperses around southern Britain. So by 800 BC, in southern Britain, this ancestry is in most places to varying degrees. So it seems it's difficult to say whether this is a single process or multiple processes happening over hundreds of years, but certainly there seems to be sort of earlier contacts with southeastern Britain in the late Bronze Age, in the middle to late Bronze Age, and then in the late Bronze Age, that ancestry spreads out across the rest of the country. So yeah, so just restating what I said before, in Margaret's Pit and Cliff's End Farm, you have these burials, these early individuals that carry this continental, potentially ancestry from Alpine Europe. And this potentially makes sense in the context of what's happening in late Bronze Age Europe, the development of the Atlantic Bronze Age and urnfield systems of exchange, where, for instance, most of the metal that you get in Britain is actually coming from continental Europe rather than Britain, compared to the early Bronze Age early Bronze Age, when it was coming mainly from Britain. But also just generally, there's a lot of practices in Britain that develop that brings it more into line with what's happening in Europe, and there's a larger development of exchange and sort of systems of ritual exchange as well across Europe. And so it makes sense that within that framework, you start to get more mobility between Britain and continental Europe as well. And when we look across continental Europe, we see that there's the homogenization of ancestries around through the same period. So from around 1500 BC to 800 BC, ancestries of people across Europe become more similar to one another. Maybe partly because you have this signal of expansion out of Alpine Europe into other parts of Europe, but also because people are just moving around more, and there's this just churn of people that are more connected within these exchange systems. And this is just a graph showing the impact of these continental ancestry in other parts of in all parts of Britain. So you can see that the orange is this continental Alpine or continental mixed ancestry, when the blue is the ancestry derived from the previous Bronze Age population. And you can see it's very regionally variable. So in southeastern Britain, the shift in ancestry is around 60%, whereas when you get to kind of the north, it's more like 30 or 40%. There could be smaller scale or different movements that are happening later on into the Iron Age. Basically, we need more sophisticated techniques to figure that out. And there's some speculation that perhaps that these movements are in some way linked to Celtic languages. It's hard to say that these migrations introduce Celtic languages themselves because they don't seem to affect Ireland or Northern Britain, where we know that people were more than likely speaking Celtic languages, but it could have something to do with the development of Brittonic and a specific form of Celtic languages in southern Britain in the late Bronze Age. Just to summarize, firstly, going right back to the beginning, genetic ancestry is not genealogy, particularly not in the distant past. Genetic ancestry is always changing through time, sometimes more slowly, sometimes more rapidly. And we have a good idea now of the key processes that shape the ancestry of the inhabitants of Britain in prehistory. And as our techniques are getting more sophisticated, we might pick up, particularly in the Iron Age, maybe further changes as a result of migration. Because what the problem is that we sort of, with the techniques and the data that we've been generating so far, we've reached the limit of what we can say. But now there's a new suite of techniques coming along that can see fine scale differences between populations that are very genetically similar to each other. So by the Iron Age, populations of Northern Europe, for instance, and Britain are very genetically similar to each other. So picking them apart becomes very difficult. But we're now developing tools to be able to distinguish between them and might be able to see more subtle changes that we might not have seen before. And more detailed studies on regions, sites, and patterns of relatedness are giving us more insight to the dynamics of ancestry change and what the processes that are responsible for these changes are, as well as these relatedness giving us a sense of sort of social structures and how kinship is referenced in death. And then we get these interesting dynamics of ancestry change and relatedness when we dig down into patterns of relatedness and ancestry at single sites and regions. So yeah, that's kind of a potted history of where we are with the genetic prehistory of Britain so far, and hopefully that was comprehensible and enjoyable. So thank you very much for listening.
Tom, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. And we've just whizzed through like tens of thousands of years in record speed. And it was amazing. Now, I've seen you talk a few times, and I've also attempted to read some of the papers that you like send around on Twitter. And I got to admit, most of them go way over my head. It's very complex information and science. But I feel like every time I see you talk, you're able to get that across to people like me who have no idea what the papers are saying in an amazing way. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you talking for us today. It looks quite nice and bright where you are. I don't know if it's somewhere different. It's like thundering where I am here. I don't know if you've angered the gods a bit, but
I'm further north. I'm in Burnley at the moment. I'm
okay.
visiting family. Yes.
There we
So the
go.
sun sets later here. It's also been a sunny day.
It's not here. It's grim. Anyway, so questions. If anyone has any questions, you can either raise your hand, or alternatively, if you don't want to say them out yourself, please feel free to write them in the chat, and we can ask them for you. Also, I do see a question saying, will the slides be available to have? I don't know about the slides, but we will have, as long as Tom allows it, we may put the talk up on our YouTube channel in the future. And I'm sure Tom will be able to direct you to places where the graphs and slides and things may be available in various papers. At some point, we can certainly distribute that. So, do we have any immediate questions? I see one hand raised already, Sandra. So, Jacob, if you're able to unmute Sandra.
Hi, hello. It was very interesting. Thank you very much. I've just typed the question in. If someone goes and has a DNA test and they come back saying, "Oh, I've got 2% Neolithic in me," is that now untrue? Is that now a reliable test?
it's complicated in that it depends what they're testing. If they're testing specifically Neolithic people from Britain, what percentage of your ancestry derives from them? I mean, it's probably next to nothing. But what they can do is but it's also very difficult to test for that specific ancestry. So what they normally do is actually test for that early European farmer ancestry that was widespread across Europe. So that's not necessarily from Britain. That could be from anywhere across Europe, and that's quite high in all populations from Britain, because you have first the Neolithic people who were in Britain, but then also obviously those populations associated with Beaker culture that come in also carry some of that ancestry. And similarly, those populations that come in at the end of the Bronze Age also have some of that ancestry. And then there are later population changes in Britain through history, but usually with groups that already carry this bit of ancestry. So it's ancestry that goes back to it's probably, if someone has given you an estimate like that, it probably is ancestry that goes back to Neolithic Europe, but it's not very specific. If you see, it's certainly not specific to Britain, and it's probably an amalgamation of ancestries over different periods. When you get your, as I should say, when you get your genetic ancestry tested through these companies, really what all the ancestry is telling you is where your ancestors over the last few hundred years came from. And you can model that ancestry as these Neolithic ancestors and things, but that's not giving you a real story of to what extent you descended from local Neolithic people. It's kind of a bit of a nonsense question, because it's entirely defined by the population histories of the places where your ancestors are from. So if your recent ancestors are from places that have that kind of ancestry, then you will have some of that ancestry. But if, for instance, say you have a recent ancestor from Spain or somewhere, they will have higher amounts of that Neolithic looking ancestry. So you'll come back with higher amounts of that. But it's a bit of a disingenuous thing to model you as, because it's not like the genetics of Britain were established in the Neolithic and then haven't changed since then. Instead, exactly the same. It's all these different changes that have happened since then, and sort of looking at it just in terms of the Neolithic ancestry, these very ancient populations, is misleading, because it gives you this block sum that is actually a culmination of all these changes that have happened in wherever your ancestors came from over the last 1,000 years. It's you can't get, in terms of population history, you can't get back to that ancient populations. It's about where your recent ancestors came from. So these genetic tests are very good in sort of telling you where your recent ancestors came from and for linking you with living distant relatives. But a lot of the time, particularly your ancestry, if you already know where, say, your great grandparents came from, then you're not going to get any surprises.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I've got a few questions in the chat, and then Louise has a hand up, so I'll start with the chat. Carol has asked, she says she went to Skara Brae last month and it was an amazing Neolithic village. Have you ever been there?
No, I'd love to go there, though. We've been talking about maybe getting some human remains from the Ness of Brodgar, but I'm not sure, which they've been digging recently, and they've just finished digging on. But yeah, I'd love to go there.
Great. Okay, Liz asks, how common is the maternal haplotype of Cheddar man in modern Britain population?
There's a lot of diversity in maternal lineages in most places, and in Britain specifically. So it's a few percent, but that is actually quite common for that. That actually means it's quite a common haplogroup, but it's also common across Europe. It's not specific to Britain. So yeah, which sort of also adds to how nonsense that story was. It's not a very specific lineage. It's quite widespread.
Thank you. Jenny Schotter has asked, assume case of a Roman cemetery. Is it already possible to identify from which part of the Roman Empire the people came from?
To a certain degree, yes. To a certain level of resolution. With the newest techniques, we can sort of distinguish between populations from, well, certainly from sort of Europe and from outside of Europe and from within Europe, but then also Northern, Southern Europe. And then within Northern Europe as well, we can distinguish between people from Britain, people with ancestry from Britain, Scandinavia, and sort of Central Europe at the moment with more studious techniques, and that will continue to improve. But yeah, broadly speaking, yes, we can.
Great. All right, Jacob, do you want to unmute Louise for us? She can ask her question.
Yes, hi. I'm really quite interested because I went up to Stouting and had a long chat with Duncan Sayer about the DNA work being done around the Anglo-Saxon population. Quite interesting to connect all this up eventually so that you get a real picture of how these, if it's possible, these populations developed into each other. I was also talking to him about the fact that I was involved in the chariot burials in East Yorkshire with Ian Stead, and he always said that he felt that they were probably an itinerant family that came over from the Champagne region. So that would be another interesting thing to follow up, to say, are these actually related to some of the Champagne stuff? So I'm interested to know, Duncan was saying that they often use the petrous bone. That's really the best place to get the DNA from. I said to him that I understood you could also get it from a tooth, but he said if you do that, the tooth has got to be entirely intact, including the root at the bottom, which, because I've done a lot of, there's often a lot that's not, because otherwise you get the contamination. So when you're doing this, I mean, yeah, you can do it, but if you don't have the petrous bone or wherever, then what do? You can't do it, presumably. So there's that, and at the moment I'm reading a wonderful book on what made humans stand upright, about the Paleolithic, the fossil record going back to Lucy and before, what made man stand upright. So I think it's really interesting how all this will slowly connect up.
Yeah, yeah, it's cool, and increasingly, I mean, particularly into the Paleolithic, I mean, the DNA doesn't survive that beyond sort of a couple of million years, but what does potentially survive is protein. So increasingly proteomics is becoming a thing where you can essentially treat proteins like you do DNA and look at relationships between extinct hominins based upon their proteins rather than the DNA. But on the petrous point, so the teeth thing, a lot of DNA labs ask for it to be intact, but I've sampled plenty of non-intact ones that have worked out fine. So I think broadly speaking, it's all right. Yeah. So also auditory ossicles, which are these tiny bones of the inner ear, are also really good for DNA, sometimes better than the petrous. But then the petrous is the next best, followed then by the tooth. And to be honest, there's a lot of people searching for other bits of the body that are good for DNA too. It's just none of them, I don't think, are ever going to be as good as the petrous, but whether any can work consistently enough to be an alternative for the reasons that you're saying, that sometimes you just don't have a skull, you don't have a petrous, you don't have a tooth. So the one that we've worked on recently is the talus. So that's the bone of your ankle, which seems promising in some cases, at least. It's not as good as a tooth or a petrous or an ossicle, but seems to be better than anything else. So in extreme cases, we can try and go for that when we really want to get a result and see whether it works.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Louise. So Teresa has said, thank you, really interesting. I'm curious about the sample sizes we have. He said that some individuals or cultures might not be preserved because of funeral practices.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely, as I talked about with the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, I think that we're very much disproportionately seeing migrants and the descendants and not the local people who are doing things for the dead, which leaves little archaeological record. But we know that these genetic changes that we see do occur, in part because we have genomes from later on, and we never see that the kind of earlier ancestry signatures re-emerge in not only later genomes, but we have modern genomes as well. So we can see that in people who live in Britain today, everybody has that steppe ancestry that, or everybody with recent ancestry from Europe has that steppe ancestry that comes in the Bronze Age. So even if these people are persisting for a few hundred years afterwards, we know that eventually their genetic signature is largely shifted or is much reduced because we've got the modern data to compare it to. So basically, if there's Neolithic people who built Stonehenge if they were hiding then they're still hiding now, if you see what I mean, because we don't have anybody that has, who with recent answer from Britain, who carries that signature without the sort of step ancestries that's with it. So while this is why I say, while we can't be exactly sure about the process and the what's happening immediately with these ancestry changes, we can be sure that they do happen eventually, because we have the kind of the end of the sentence in terms of the living people as well as people who lived later.
Thank you. Okay, Susan has asked, are the modelling techniques used in Britain and Europe validated by the same techniques used in other parts of the world?
Yeah, the same. There's now really a suite of techniques which are used everywhere, really. And there's new techniques coming along that are kind of building upon those, but they sort of are the same sort of principles that are behind them. They're all based on the same thing.
Amazing. Okay, we have possibly one more question from Margaret Simmons, but I don't know if it is an actual question or not. So we'll just wait and see 1 second. Margaret, are you able to, maybe if Jacob can unmute, we can unmute Margaret. We can see if it was a question or just an accident there. No, nothing. Okay, all right. Well, oh, one last one, sorry. From Mike. So you said step ancestry is related to Indo-European languages. Is that pretty much certain now?
Yeah, I think so. I think I mean there's probably still some holdouts, but while the correlation isn't perfect, like for instance, Basque, the Basque language is non-Indo-European, but Basque people do have some step ancestry. And there's some quirks. It's just that otherwise the association between step ancestry and Indo-European languages in Europe, at least, is just too strong for it not to be. There's a bit of disagreement about what's happening in Anatolia and how, because it seems like that. Well, there's argument of whether Indo-European languages get to Anatolia without there being step ancestry or movements of step. But broadly speaking, I think there's a consensus now that it has to be those, because both the linguistics point at a step origin for Indo-European languages, and now that genetics is pointing that as being the most likely situation as well. So there are a few things certainly to resolve, but I think that the consensus is now that is pretty much the solution now.
Awesome. It's just people saying how great a talk it was. And I was just going to ask, actually, sneak in at the end. So this talk obviously was just up to the sort of late Bronze Age, early Iron Age. Are you working on late Iron Age Roman, early Saxon stuff now? Is that something that's happening, or is it something that's already happened?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's already papers that so the previous lady was saying Duncan Sayer was worked on the Saxons, and there's not much Roman, but we're doing a lot of Romans, doing a lot of Saxons. We're doing a lot of later period skeletons from the last 1,000 years as well. So we're hoping to get a pretty comprehensive analysis, and similarly more Iron Age as well, because I think there's still potentially more going on in the Iron Age that we can't see because it's involving people and groups that are actually genetically quite closely related to each other. But these new techniques that Leo Spiedel in our lab has developed means that we can now see the difference. So we're hoping to generate more genomes from Iron Age Britain to see if we can see some differences, like as well with those chariot burials from East Yorkshire, which at least from the glance that's been given so far with the techniques that have been available previously, they didn't seem to be linked to the Paris Basin, but it could just be that or to the Champagne region burials, but it could just be that they're too genetically similar to pick up to identify at the moment. So it's still a bit of an open question. But at the moment, the genetics says that somehow they're, at least the people at least, are very local. In fact, most of the people in those square ditch barrows from East Yorkshire, Iron Age square ditch barrows, seem to be related to each other and potentially matrilineally related as well. So there seems to be a matrilineal pattern of descent in terms of who ends up in those big square ditch barrow cemeteries, including the people who end up in the chariots as well.
I'm going to pick your brains about late Iron Age stuff, probably over a beer at some time.
It's all right.
I got one last
just,
question for you,
yeah,
if that's all right. If you're
livestock.
yeah.
Yeah, people are working on ancient genomes from animals as well, and it's interesting because it's different with the different animals, because obviously there's some animals that get introduced that weren't around, like sheep and goats, but you see with pigs, for instance, because they're managed differently, by the time they get to Britain, they just look like pigs from Mesolithic Britain or from Mesolithic Europe, because they start off with pigs that they bring with them from Anatolia, but because they're kind of left to run around in the forests, they mix with the local pigs, with the local kind of boar, until by the time they mix so much that by the time they get all the way up to Britain, they just look like local, or at least like the pigs that were in Europe beforehand. Whereas the cows maintain to some extent, the cows are a bit more of a mix, so it seems like that they do try and potentially breed them with local aurochs, and maybe sort of try and do some domestication with local aurochs. And by the time they get to Britain, there's kind of a mix, and then there seems to be further mixing with local aurochs when they get there. So it's interesting is that it can really depend on the domesticated animals. It can depend on the type of animal and how they're managed, whether their ancestry changes as well in the same way.
Okay, so I'm going to leave it there so that Tom can get back to his life. Thank you everyone for attending today, and thank you, Tom, so much for that talk and for answering
No
all of
problem,
our
Craig. My
questions.
pleasure.
It's been amazing. Just last thing to say is we have this is the first of our series of upcoming talks, so keep an eye out on the emails and our social media for upcoming talks. On Thursday, the 29th of August, we've got Reinvestigating Richborough, Connecting the Narrative by Philip Smither. The date is changing on this one, but sometime in October, probably, we have Randall Manor Revealed, Community Archaeological Excavations in Shoreham Woods County Park from Andrew Mayfield. On the 24th of October, Diving with a Purpose, the SSTR Thompson project from Tad Tabara, which will be amazing. And the last one of the year, I think, is going to be coinciding with Gladiator 2 coming out, the Septimius Severus talk with Simon Elliott, our very own. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone. Lots of thanks and fascinating talk comments coming through there for you, Tom. Thank you. Really appreciate it. So we're going to leave it now, and we'll see you all again very soon. Take care, guys.